There was a girl named Alice who lived in a small town. She was cheerful and sociable. She had a lot of friends. But one day she met a boy named Jimmy who lived next door. Jimmy was an introverted and strange child. He always wore sunglasses, rarely smiled. However, Alice decided to make friends with him because she was interested in getting to know him better. At first, Jimmy seemed friendly and open. He told Alice about his hobbies and interests, and they spent a lot of time together. But over time, Alice began to notice strange things. Jimmy began to spend more and more time alone, and his behavior became more and more strange. He began to disappear for several days, and when he returned, he looked exhausted and ill. One day, when Alice asked Jimmy where he was going, he replied that he went to an abandoned house on the outskirts of the city. Alice, worried about Jimmy's condition, decided to find out more about the abandoned house. She had heard strange stories about him from her friends, but did not believe in them, considering them to be just children's stories. Now that she found out that Jimmy was spending time there, interest and anxiety only increased. One evening, when Jimmy disappeared again, Alice decided to go to the abandoned house. She took a flashlight and, trying not to attract attention, headed for the outskirts of the city. The house looked gloomy and ominous, its windows were broken, and the doors were barely hanging on their hinges. As she got closer, Alice felt a chill went to her bones, and a strange smell of rot coming from inside. She heard faint sounds, as if someone was whispering or crying. Summoning all her courage, Alice went inside. The inside of the house was even more creepy than the outside. There was trash everywhere. Floors creaked underfoot, and the walls were covered with incomprehensible symbols and words that looked like spells. Alice walked through the corridors, her heart pounding in her chest. She noticed a faint light coming from one of the rooms. As Alice got closer, she saw Jimmy. He was sitting on the floor, surrounded by candles, and looked even more emaciated and ill. Deep shadows were visible on his face, and his eyes shone with a mad fire. "Jimmy, what are you doing here?" Alice asked, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. Jimmy slowly raised his head and looked at her. "Alice, you shouldn't have come here," whispered. Alice shuddered at these words, but decided to find out more. "I came because you're my only friend. Why do you keep coming here?" "I can't leave," replied. "The house keeps me here. If I try to leave, he'll make it worse." Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. Alice felt the cold fingers of fear squeeze her heart. The shadows on the walls began to move, coming to life and taking the form of terrible creatures with long claws and empty eyes. They were getting closer to Alice and Jimmy, their whispers getting louder. "You have to leave," Jimmy shouted. "Run away before it's too late." Alice rushed to the door, but it was locked. The shadows were getting closer to her, their clawed hands reaching for her face. She felt the cold seep into her bones and realized that her strength was leaving her. Jimmy grabbed one of the candles and rushed at the shadows, trying to distract them from Alice. "Run! Stop it!" he shouted. "I'll hold them off." Alice, gathering her last strength, rushed to the window and knocked it out, falling to the ground from the first floor. She looked back and saw Jimmy disappearing into the shadows, his screams echoing throughout the house. Alice ran away without looking back. She got home and, panting, told her parents everything. The next day, police searched the abandoned house but found neither Jimmy nor any trace of what was going on there. Since then, Alice has avoided talking about the abandoned house. But every time she passed him, she heard whispers and saw shadows moving inside. She knew Jimmy was gone. The house continued to live a terrible life, demanding new victims. A few weeks have passed, and life in the town has returned to normal, as far as it was possible after all the events. However, the strange disappearances continued. People began to be afraid to go out at night, and children did not play outside after sunset. But despite all the precautions, the disappearances did not stop. One evening, Alice received a strange letter with no return address. Inside was just a piece of paper with a single phrase, "He's still here." Alice recognized Jimmy's handwriting. At that moment, she realized that she had to return to the abandoned house and put an end to this nightmare. Taking a flashlight and an old knife she found in the pantry, Alice headed for the house. Inside, everything was just as dark and creepy. Alice walked through the corridors, trying to ignore the whispers and shadows that seemed to be watching her every move. Eventually, she reached the very room where she had last seen Jimmy. But instead of emptiness and darkness, she was greeted by an eerie sight. Jimmy was standing in the middle of the room. His eyes were completely black, and a black haze was coming out of his mouth. Around him on the floor lay the remains of other victims who had disappeared in recent weeks. "Alice," whispered, his voice distorted and barely recognizable. "You came. The house was waiting for you." Alice felt her heart clench with fear and grief. "Jimmy, I'm here to set you free," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You don't understand," Jimmy said. "The house won't let me go. He wants you. You have to leave before it's too late." Alice felt her heart clench with fear and grief. "Jimmy, I'm here to set you free," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You don't understand," Jimmy said. "The house won't let me go. He wants you. You have to leave before it's too late." Suddenly, a malicious man with lifeless eyes and a sinister grin on his face came out of the shadows. He was dressed in antique clothes, covered with dust and cobwebs, as if he had come out of a long-forgotten nightmare. He was holding an iron chain in his hands. "Well, another sacrifice for the house," he said, his voice cold and chilling. "Both of you will serve him." Alice rushed to the door, but the man grabbed her arm and threw her to the floor. Jimmy tried to protect her, but the man hit him with a chain, and Jimmy fell unconscious. Alice screamed and tried to pull away, but the man was too strong. He dragged them both up the stairs leading to the basement. With each step, the shadows grew thicker and the ominous whispers grew louder. The basement was cold and damp. The walls were covered with mold and cobwebs. The man locked the door behind them, leaving Alice and Jimmy in total darkness. Alice felt fear gripping her heart. She picked Jimmy up and hugged him to her, trying to warm him with her warmth. "Jimmy, please wake up," she whispered through her tears. "We have to get out of here." After a few minutes, Jimmy came to his senses. He struggled to his feet and hugged Alice. "We have to find a way out," he said, his voice full of determination. "We can't stay here." They began to explore the basement, trying to find at least some way out. Suddenly, Alice came across an old book covered with dust and cobwebs. She opened it and saw that the pages were filled with spells and symbols, similar to those she had seen on the walls of the house. "This could be the key to our salvation," she said, showing Jimmy the book. "We have to read it out loud." But as Alice scrolled through the pages, she noticed that the key pages were missing. Trying not to panic, she looked at Jimmy. "Part of the book is missing. We won't be able to finish the spell." Jimmy gritted his teeth and looked around. In the corner of the room, he noticed how the shadows were beginning to thicken, and heard the footsteps of the malicious man returning to them. "We have to find another way," whispered. The man entered the basement with a cruel grin on his face. "Well, have you found your way out?" Grinned, lifting the chain ready for another blow. Alice, noticing the key hanging on a chain at his belt, realized abruptly that this might be their only chance. "Jimmy," she whispered, squeezing Jimmy's hand so that he would understand her intention. Jimmy nodded, and they charged at the same time. Alice grabbed the book and punched the man in the face, while Jimmy threw himself at his feet, trying to confuse him. The man was violently swinging the chain, striking blows that left deep wounds on their bodies. Alice, suffering pain, rushed to the key. The man pushed her away, throwing her against the wall. Jimmy was able to grab the chain at that time, and forcefully tore off the key, holding it in his hand. Man, realizing that they had taken the key, roared with rage and unleashed all his strength on Jimmy. "Alice, take it!" Jimmy shouted, throwing the key to Alice, who caught it at the last moment. Clutching the key, she ran to the door, inserting it into the lock and turning it. The door slowly opened, and the shadows began to disperse. "Jimmy, come on," she shouted, helping him up. They ran up the stairs, leaving the roaring man behind. The wounds on their bodies were bleeding, but they didn't stop, rushing towards the exit. When they reached the surface, sunlight illuminated their faces. They ran out of the house and stopped, breathing heavily. Alice and Jimmy, bloodied and exhausted, hugged each other, feeling their hearts beating in unison. "We did it," Alice whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Jimmy nodded, smiling faintly. They knew that they had narrowly escaped a terrible fate, but the wounds on their bodies and souls would heal for a long time. They walked slowly towards the city, supporting each other. Their love and determination helped them cope with the horrors of an abandoned house, and now they knew that together, they could overcome any challenges.